welcome to everybody to the SCLF webinar on the new Scottish Groundwater Standards. We've got three presenters today, Isla Smail from SEPA, Helen McMillan from RSK, and Alison from Leapmore. We'll go through the presentations one by one. As I say, we are a little bit tight for time, so we're just going to push on through. There is a question section up the top where you can ask questions of our presenters. Just because we've got a lot of people on the webinar today, we're going to ask if people could just keep their questions to maybe the last, if you don't ask them till the last 10 minutes or so, just so that we can pick out the ones that we're going to go through. We think we might get more questions than we've got the time to deal with today. So the presenters are going to take any questions that we don't get answered today away with them, and we'll issue sort of like an FAQ sheet after the fact for any we don't get round to. And when people do start asking questions in the box, if you see one that you'd like to ask that's already been asked, there's a function there to like upvote it. And what we'll do is at the end, we'll pick the questions that have got the most votes first and ask them in that order. So our first presenter today is Isla Smail from SEPA, and she's just going to give us a SEPA run through on the new groundwater standards. So over to you, Isla, if you want to present your slides.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to bring up my slides. Hopefully they will materialize shortly. If you could let me know, Eve or Helen, that you can see them.
Yes, okay. We can see them now. Yeah.
Okay, great. So hello everyone. For those who don't know me, I'm Isla Smail. I'm one of SEPA's principal hydrogeologists in our water resources team. I've been asked to give an overview of the new groundwater standards that have just come out and SEPA's new associated guidance. And these new standards, the guidance are have the aim of protecting Scotland's groundwater quality. So I'm just going to give a brief update on the new standards and our new guidance. This is going to sound very familiar to some of you because it does build on a previous joint consultation between the Scottish Government and SEPA that was held back in 2021. And I'm not going to go through the guidance line by line. We're going to focus on the key changes just to kind of keep this presentation to a manageable length. And one thing I would say that although at first glance, some of our guidance might seem very different, and it has been reorganised and updated and reformatted, a lot of the technical detail remains the same as before. So at first glance, superficially, it might look very different, but at the actual meat of the guidance, there is a lot of similarity with what has gone before. So it's important to bear that in mind as we go on. So late last year, the Scottish Government published new directions on both standards and status. There's two versions, one for each river basin district that applies in Scotland. There is no significant difference between the Scotland version and the Solway Tweed version. It's just an artifact of the way WFD works in Scotland. It is important to note that the new directions do cover more than just groundwater. They cover a variety of environmental issues, but today I'm just going to focus on the groundwater part of the changes. So based on those new directions for both standards and status, SEPA have updated our guidance. So we've updated our guidance on assigning groundwater assessment criteria for pollutant impacts, which is more commonly referred to as WATPS 10. So now we have WATPS 10.02, which is the new version. And we've also updated our guidance on land contamination and impacts on the water environment. And this, in the past, previous incarnations of this guidance were referred to as the Brown Booklet, even though it hasn't been brown or a booklet for a very long time, but that might be a term you're more familiar with. And our WATPS 10.02 is also supplemented by a list of groundwater standards, which is a sort of separate but sister document to WATPS 10. So previously the list of standards was incorporated within WAT PS10, but now we've separated it out into a separate document. And that's just going to make it easier for us to keep it up to date as we move forward. For example, were a new drinking water standard to be published or something similar. So when do the new standards and guidance apply? So they apply to all sectors across Scotland. They apply at all stages of your project lifecycle, from planning through to surrender. They also apply to historical land contamination associated with past activities. And really, when are you going to need to think about them? Well, it's really when you're doing a hydrogeological risk assessment. That's the main time that you'll need to think about our standards or look at our guidance. So what does the new guidance cover? It doesn't cover everything. So it covers groundwater quality from chemical contaminants. It also, the supporting guidance also covers land contamination risks to the water environment. It doesn't cover radiological risks, but I do, given there's many people on the call who might be interested, I do want to flag that SEPA does currently have a consultation out on our website about assessing radiological risks to groundwater. So if that's a field you're involved in, you might want to go and take a look at that consultation. The new guidance also doesn't cover groundwater from a quantitative point of view. So it doesn't cover groundwater levels or flows. It doesn't cover water scarcity or drought. And it is groundwater specific. So it only covers surface water as it applies to groundwater. It doesn't cover surface water in its own right. Nor does the land contamination guidance cover risks to human health or property. So we're really focusing on groundwater quality in this talk today, and that's the main meat of what the guidance covers. So WAT PS 1002 is the main thing that's changed or has the most significant changes. That's what the majority of this presentation is going to focus on. So the guidance sets out the legislative objectives for groundwater quality in Scotland, provides guidance on how you select relevant groundwater quality standards for assessing groundwater. It provides general guidance on risk assessment for groundwater and groundwater dependent receptors. And it provides guidance for what steps you might consider if it's not going to be feasible for you to achieve the groundwater objectives in full. As I previously mentioned, the overall approach is very similar to our previous guidance. We're looking for a phased approach to risk assessment based on a source pathway receptor framework. And the level of detail and the amount of effort required in your risk assessment process is going to vary depending on the level of risk. So a very simple situation can have a very light touch risk assessment. A more complex site will require more detail. That's no different to the previous approach. So we have our objectives for groundwater quality in Scotland. So we are seeking to control inputs of hazardous substances into groundwater and to limit inputs of non-hazardous substances such that it doesn't result in pollution. We want to prevent deterioration in groundwater body status and, where feasible, return groundwater bodies back to good status. And we also have a requirement to prevent direct discharges of groundwater of hazardous or non-hazardous substances. So those are the 5 objectives. They're very similar to previously. Previously, we did refer to preventing inputs of hazardous substances, but in practice, that isn't what we were doing. And so we have changed the wording ever so slightly to refer to controlling inputs of hazardous substances, because that better reflects the approach that we're taking. So what are the new standards? So there's 3 sets of standards that apply. So input standards apply to substances classed as hazardous to groundwater. And when are you going to use input standards? It's when you might have previously used a minimum reporting value, or MRV. And this is for these standards, groundwater is your receptor. And then We also have pollution and status standards. These apply to non-hazardous substances, but may also apply to hazardous substances if those substances have already entered groundwater due to historical contamination. And the pollution and status standards apply to groundwater resources, but they also apply to groundwater dependent receptors. And I'm just going to run through the changes for each of these three categories now. So where we previously had minimum reporting values, now we have hazardous substance input standards. This is a twin track system depending on how close you are to surface waters. As before, as with MRVs, the assessment point continues to be the base of the unsaturated zone. So it's the point of entry into groundwater. And the assessment criteria is based on either potable standards for most groundwater, or if you're very close to surface waters, then the surface water environmental standard can be taken into account. Or in both cases, it's assessed as an annual average. These standards apply to shallow groundwater and to onshore groundwater. They do also apply to groundwater that's at greater than 400 meters depth or offshore of mean high water springs, if that groundwater is fresh or if there is a potential pathway to surface ecosystems. So because it's a twin track system, what do you do if you have a source zone that straddles the 50 meter boundary? Well, you can either zone your source and assess the different parts of it individually, or you can pick the lower of the two standards and apply that across your whole source, which is a simpler but more conservative approach. Then for pollution standards, so the main change here is in relation to future groundwater resource. The pollution standards for abstraction, surface waters and wetlands has not changed significantly. The main change is for future groundwater resource. We've moved from a distance-based standard to an area-based standard. So our spatial assessment rule is that pollution is deemed to have occurred where the area of groundwater impacted is more than 1 hectare in plan view area. And the assessment concentration is now set at the threshold value, and it's assessed on an annual average basis. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this to explain that the new area-based standards in more detail later on in the presentation, but that's just the kind of the main change to the pollution standards. And for status standards, again, the main change is to future groundwater resource. So now for hazardous substances, the area-based standard is now 20 hectares, and for non-hazardous substances is assessed across the groundwater body. And just for context, the smallest groundwater body in Scotland is 1.7 kilometres, square kilometres in area. Again, similar to the pollution standards, it's based on threshold values and annual averaging. The other standards haven't changed, apart from the only other change that, apologies, you might want to note is that the status test for groundwater dependent terrestrial ecosystems now refers to designated sites. So for pollution, it's any wetland that's groundwater dependent, but for status, it's only designated wetlands that are groundwater dependent. So those are the main changes for the status standards. So, as I previously mentioned, we have published a list of groundwater standards for common contaminants of concern. It's a big long list, giant table, and the list helps you determine whether the substance is currently classed as hazardous or non-hazardous. It presents values for the relevant standards and gives you an indication of where that standard has come from. If your contaminant isn't on the list, you can still derive a standard using the methodology that's set out in the government directions. So there's it's possible to derive your own standard if required, if it isn't on the list already. We haven't set quantitative standards for heat or microbiology. We're just looking that anthropogenic changes don't cause adverse impact on groundwater-dependent receptors. So there isn't a numeric value currently for heat or for microbiology because that really needs to be assessed on a site-specific basis. So those are the new standards. So the area-based standards approach. So this applies to future groundwater resource tests for both pollution and for status. And what we're looking at for the area is the area of both the source and the plume combined. So it's the whole area. So your source area and your plume area in plan view, what size is that? For pollution, it's 1 hectare, and for status standard for hazardous substances, it's 20 hectares. And what we're looking at here is your maximum expected plume extent. So not just your current plume, but what size do you think the plume will reach when it reaches its maximum? And how do you decide what the edge of your plume is? Well, the edge of your plume, in simplistic terms, is where the concentration is equal to the threshold value. This area-based approach does really require robust source characterization. Understanding the geometry of your source is really important, and understanding how your plume might evolve based on your hydrogeological setting is also important. Both those things are things that ideally you should have already been doing, but they are of increasing importance in this new approach. If you have multiple sources on a site of the same type of contaminant, you do also need to think about whether or not you might need to account for cumulative effects. So do you assess your sources and plumes independently or as a combined source and plume? And as a rule of thumb, if your plumes are expected to overlap, then you should be probably looking to consider it as a combined source. But if they're discrete plumes that don't interact with each other, then you may be able to assess them individually. We can also, instead of using the area, we can also use an equivalent assessment distance. This is particularly if you want to do any two-dimensional risk assessment modeling, such as using the RTM method. So equivalent assessment distances are measured from the upgradient boundary of your source. So that is different to the previous approach where we assessed a distance from the downgradient boundary. Now we're using the upgradient boundary. And our equivalent assessment distance is it's a site-specific calculation. You're basically taking your area metric, so your 1 hectare or 20 hectares, and then dividing that by the width of your source perpendicular to the groundwater flow direction. So that's going to give you a different number for every site because your source geometry will vary. We have set caps on the maximum distance that you should be thinking about. So for pollution, for that 1 hectare, we're looking at a 500-meter cap as the maximum assessment distance. And for the 20-hectare status test, then the cap is 4 kilometers. I'm just going to give you a wee example just to kind of talk you through how you might apply this in practice. So in this example, we have a historical DNAPL contamination of some trichloroethylene. So we have some TCE-free product. We don't have any groundwater dependent receptors nearby, so we're only considering the groundwater resource, the groundwater itself and the groundwater resource tests in this example. So the groundwater is flowing from left to right across your page, and our source term is around about 25 meters diameter. We do have a plume, and our plume contains TCE, but it's also degrading to DCE and vinyl chloride. So the first kind of conceptual question to think about in your risk assessment is, do I have entry to groundwater? Has my DNAPL already reached the water table? Is there any reason why partitioning from the DNAPL phrase into groundwater wouldn't occur? I think in most cases in Scotland, groundwater is comparatively shallow. And so unless there is a barrier in your subsurface that would significantly constrain DNAPL migration downwards, at many sites it is probable that your DNAPL will have reached groundwater if it is a historic leak or spill. So, do we have entry? And then our source area is less than a hectare, but we're looking at our source plus our plume. So let's look at our equivalent assessment distance. So for pollution, so we take our 1 hectare or 10,000 square meters, we divide that by the source width, and that gives you an equivalent assessment distance of around 400 meters. For our status test, we take our 20 hectares, or 200,000 square meters, again divided by the source width, and this time that gives you around 8,000 meters, but remember there is a cap, so it's a 4 kilometer cap that we'd apply in this scenario. When we've looked at our site, we think the maximum extent of the source plus the plume, including all the degradation products, is going to be around 500 meters. So when it comes to the future groundwater resource, we do have entry of groundwater occurring in this scenario. It's failing the pollution test because the 500 meters length is greater than the equivalent assessment distance of 400 meters, but it's not failing the status test. And what might you do about that? Well, we'll come on to that a bit later in terms of exemptions, but you might look at what is the technical feasibility of treating the plume or treating the DNAPL source. One new change in our approach, in our guidance, is that our groundwater standards are fixed unless you can demonstrate that upgradient concentrations are naturally elevated. So not elevated due to historical human activity, but natural causes. This is more conservative than our previous approach, but it does align better with what we do for surface waters, and it helps us account for cumulative pressures. Just because groundwater is already contaminated, we don't want to be making it worse. And this may mean there's a requirement for additional treatment or mitigation prior to discharge or placement of materials for new activities. However, you can take background concentrations into account when you're setting site-specific compliance criteria to monitor the performance of a site or the performance of a remediation scheme. Similarly, you can take into account limits of detection when setting compliance criteria. And your compliance criteria can be agreed on a site-specific basis or even a borehole-specific basis. And they don't need to be the same as the groundwater standards. They can be set on a site-by-site basis. So if you can't meet the groundwater objectives, what happens next? So the Groundwater Directive allows for some exemptions from meeting groundwater objectives. And it's really important to note that although we've provided sort of tweaks to our guidance, the legal basis for exemptions from the Groundwater Directive is unchanged. So there's no change to the legal basis for the exemptions. but our guidance has been revamped slightly. Some key things to note are that the disproportionate cost exemption really only applies to historical land contamination. And it's also important to recognise when you're looking at exemptions that even if it's not going to be feasible to achieve the objectives or the standards in full at a particular site, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't aim for partially meeting the objectives as far as is practicable. So we're looking for betterment, particularly when it comes to historical land contamination. And exemptions are not a given. Your relevant regulator, whether that's SEPA or your local authority or the Scottish Government, does need to agree to apply those exemptions. And the use of exemptions needs to be documented in a transparent way, and justification needs to be provided. So if you're asking for an exemption to be applied, then make sure you provide clear evidence and site-specific reasons why an exemption should be considered for a particular site. We have also refreshed our guidance on land contamination and impacts on the water environment. It's a refresh and a reformatting. It's not a major revamp, and overall the guidance in the fundamentals is broadly similar to our previous guidance. It's important to note that this guidance only applies to historical land contamination, and it doesn't apply to current or future activities. It does cover both planning and Part 2A scenarios. One thing to note that we previously proposed changing in our 2021 consultation was the criteria for special sites. However, that proposed change hasn't been implemented as yet. We're still in discussions with Scottish Government about that, so the special site criteria remain unchanged at the moment. Now, the new standards and our new guidance came into force at the start of this month. There is a transition period until the 1st of July, and during this period you can use either the old approach or the new approach. We do have guidance on the SEPA website about the transition period. The new approach should be adopted for new applications and variations after the 1st of July date, or ideally before, but definitely after the 1st of July date. But for existing sites, we're not going to retrospectively apply the new standards. When we're regulating those sites, we will take into account what's going to be practicable or reasonable and best for environment as a whole. So we're not going to necessarily revisit past permitting or regulatory decisions. But obviously, if those sites were to request any future changes, then the new approach should apply to those future changes. And that's it from me. I'm going to hand over to Helen now, or back to Eve in the first instance. So that's
Perfect.
a whistle-stop tour of the new standards.
Thank you very much for that, Isla. We are just going to push straight on with Helen's presentation. So just while she gets her slides up, this is Helen McMillan of RSK Geosciences. Helen's a technical director there, and her presentation today is regards the changes to WAP PS10, implications for assessing risks from historical land contamination, and industry perspective from Helen. So I'll just let you take over now, Helen.
Great. Thank you, Eve, and thanks, Isla, for your presentation as well and putting it into context. So as Eve was saying, I'm going to be looking at implications for assessing risks to future groundwater resource from historical land contamination and providing an industry perspective on that. So it is kind of very focused on a particular aspect of the WAP PS10 guidance. While I'm presenting this, I do want to acknowledge my colleagues, Tom Henman and Neil Brown. They have acted as sounding boards. If anyone's looked at the guidance, it is quite complex, and to get your head round, and in particular, Neil has done a quick sense check of my slides. So hopefully what I'm presenting isn't out there, and it's kind of as the guidance is meant to be seen. So my talk is going to cover these things. So what I thought would be useful was to just go over some of the key changes between the old WAT PS 1001 and the new guidance, WAT PS 1002. We're going to look at the risk assessment considerations, and I'm going to apply that to the LCRM framework, the tiered risk assessment approach we're all familiar with, and how we set our reports up in accordance with. So looking at the implications for preliminary risk assessment, generic quantitative risk assessment, and detailed quantitative risk assessments, all three tiers of risk assessment. I'm then going to touch on the exemptions and how they could be applied if you're not able to meet the groundwater objectives, and then just provide a quick summary and overview. I've got these caveats here. So as I said, I'm just looking at historical land contamination sources, and also just looking at the future groundwater resource receptor. The guidance covers more than this, so my talk is very focused, but I think Isla picked up in her talk, one of the main changes comes with when you're assessing risk to the future groundwater resource. The other thing is, this is my interpretation of the guidance. I don't have all the answers. Those of you that have read the guidance might have come to a different opinion, and I'd really welcome any feedback you have on my presentation. I think the only way to really fully understand the implications of the guidance is for us consultants to apply it to our risk assessments and then get feedback from the regulators. So I think it really is, there's going to be a time that we're going to need to collaborate, both industry and regulators together, just to make sure our reports are, going to get through planning. We're doing the best job for our clients within the appropriate timescales. So the previous approach to assessing risk from historic land contamination, so hazardous and non-hazardous substances were assessed in the same way. And it comprised a linear approach. So you would look at your source, and then the assessment point would be 50 metres from the down gradient edge of the source zone, which could be extended up to 250 metres. And your assessment limit would be 100% of your resource protection value or drinking water standard, and that could be adjusted to take into account of background upgradient concentrations. And this is a similar approach. Broadly, there are some differences, but broadly similar to what the rest of the UK applies and is currently applying. However, in the new approach, hazardous and non-hazardous substances need to be considered separately. So for your hazardous substances, they need to be assessed as an annual mean concentration against a hazardous substance input standard at the base of the unsaturated zone. And this is prior to discharge into groundwater. And groundwater is any groundwater. It's irrespective of the aquifer size or productivity. The way in which the hazardous substance input standard is calculated depends on the proximity to surface water courses. And if you've got an ongoing source, so for example, NAPOL or elevated soil leachate, then you need to assess risks even if contaminants have already entered into groundwater. So the objective for hazardous substances is to control their input into groundwater to prevent deterioration in groundwater quality. So this is maybe slightly more flexible than the previous approach, which was to prevent entry, which Isla alluded to in her presentation. And as part of compliance criteria, you may be able to consider dilution within the underlying groundwater body as part of that. One thing to note is resource protection values, they're no longer used. The new terminology is a potable standard, and this is based on a drinking water standard, which can be capped by the effective solubility limit. In terms of non-hazardous substances, They're to be assessed spatially from the upgradient boundary of the source, including the maximum predicted plume extent. The groundwater pollution standard for future groundwater resources is set at greater than 1 hectare of groundwater exceeding the threshold value, and that's equivalent to 75% of the potable standard, and that's assessed as an annual mean concentration. You also have to look at the groundwater status, and that standard for future groundwater resources is set at more than 20 hectares for hazardous substances, but for non-hazardous substances, that comprises the entire groundwater body, although the guidance does say that 200 hectares could be considered sufficient as an initial estimate. This assessment, while it's looking at non-hazardous substances, it can also be applied to hazardous substances if they've already entered into groundwater. So some points to note is there's a bit of a change from the previous approach. So in the new approach, the spatial assessment is applied from the upgradient boundary of the source. So up here, oh, sorry, back. Previously, it was applied at the downgradient source boundary, so it is becoming more conservative. The groundwater pollution standard for future groundwater resources is set at more than 1 hectare of the groundwater exceeding threshold value. Oh, sorry, I'm going back. Sorry, I already said that. The assessment limits can't be adjusted for upgradient groundwater quality. However, compliance criteria may take into account background concentrations. The assessment limits are compared against an annual mean concentration, and the source is what has given rise to the groundwater contamination. So, for example, your soil source, what's available to still leach, it could be NAPL or a landfill footprint. Once it's entered into groundwater, it comprises a plume and not a source. So there's subtle differences, but kind of important for putting it into the risk assessment context. So when I was reading the guidance, I kind of jotted down some questions that I thought would be useful to kind of go over here. One of the first questions is, could the contamination be considered historical? It's not explicitly stated in the guidance. However, you can infer that any pollution that has occurred after the implementation of the CAR regs in 2011, that would not be considered historical. So by inference, you could say anything pre-2011 would be historical contamination. So you need to have a think about that in terms of your site and whether historical land contamination applies or not. Also, even if it does comprise historical land contamination, you still need to assess inputs of hazardous substances from unsaturated soils and NAPL sources if there's a potential for an ongoing source. So you need to consider the age of the source, the nature of the contaminants, and also have a think, will your site conditions change? So that could result in additional leaching. For example, you could have removal of hard standing, material movements, putting in drainage. Another thing which I think is quite critical, and what I wanted to include here is, are you going to be reusing material on site? So historical land contamination applies to soils that are in situ. As soon as you excavate it and were to reuse it elsewhere, it would become a new source. So is your risk assessment still valid? The guidance also says that material should not be placed below the water table, resulting in a direct discharge of pollutants to groundwater, unless an appropriate low permeability engineered barrier is installed. So these are all things that you need to have a think about if you're redeveloping your site, reusing materials, or as part of your remediation scheme. Another thing the guidance includes now is that you need to consider climate change and extreme weather within your conceptual site model. So climate change has a potential to change source, pathway and receptor relationships. The degree to which climate change may or may not affect your conceptual site model will depend on meteorological, hydrological and hydrogeological considerations. SOBRA have produced a guidance document on this. So it's available on the portal. I would say go and read that if you want to understand how to include for climate change within your water environment risk assessments. The other thing would be, is your plume ever going to exceed your pollution status or spatial assessment rules? So I'm going to come on to this later. Isla's already kind of gone over it, but I will recap on it. Have you got more than one hydrogeological unit? So you need to assess your risks to each hydrogeological unit identified at the appropriate receptor. And finally, am I competent to complete the assessment? So the guidance says that you need to be appropriately qualified and have the relevant experience to undertake a site-specific assessment. For example, are you signed off under NQMS or a similar scheme, such as an accredited risk assessor with SOBRA for the water environment? So going on to the tiers of risk assessment, the first stage in any risk assessment is the Tier 1 preliminary risk assessment. So everyone, I'm sure, is aware of the source pathway receptor methodology. So you identify if you've got those present, have you got a pollutant linkage, and then you would undertake a risk assessment and assign a risk rating based on the severity and likelihood of that risk. And anything with a risk rating of low/moderate or above would then require further investigation and assessment. So non-hazardous substances and hazardous substances that have already entered groundwater. The receptor you're going to be looking at will be one of your statutory designated water environment receptors, such as surface water, groundwater body of future resource potential and abstraction, a groundwater dependent terrestrial ecosystem. And the linking pathways for that source, you could consider leaching, dilution, and migration in groundwater. However, for hazardous substances, the receptor comprises any groundwater, and that's irrespective of its quantity or quality. So this will include perched water in made ground. So that's quite a distinct difference. As the objective for hazardous substances is to control their entry into groundwater to prevent deterioration, I don't think you can assess the severity of the impact, because if it enters into groundwater, it's going to be a risk. However, you may be able to look at the likelihood of this happening. So you could consider the age of the source and the properties of the contaminants. So could they have leached or volatilized fully in that time frame? Probably more applicable for sources that have been, around for a long, long time rather than more recent sources. Are your site conditions going to change? For example, are you going to get rid of hard standing cover as part of your development, and then that would allow new leaching pathways to develop? So I think this is one of the implications that we're going to have. The guidance isn't just going to start when you look at the quantitative risk assessment. You need to think about it at the Tier 1 stage. So you will need to consider your hazardous substances separately in the initial conceptual site model and preliminary risk assessment. And if it is identified as a potentially significant linkage based on your likelihood considerations, then you are going to have to consider this within your site investigation design. So that would be like making sure you've got samples from your unsaturated zone. So Alison's going to be talking about that more in her presentation later. So for the next slides, because they've got different implications, I'm going to separate out the assessment of hazardous substances from those non-hazardous or hazardous substances that have already entered into groundwater. So effectively looking at soil sources for HAZ and groundwater sources for the others. So after your Tier 1 PRA, you would then undertake a generic quantitative risk assessment once you've got your site investigation data back. I will say there is a bit of a difference in terminology between the tiers of assessment between LCRM and those that are in the new WAT PS10 guidance. They're not quite directly comparable, so I've included both in the headers of my slides just for reference. So as we said, looking at the Tier 2 GQRA for hazardous substances, effectively a Tier 1 screen and WAT PS10. The assessment point for hazardous substances is the base of the unsaturated zone. with contaminants assessed against the hazardous substance input standard assessed as an annual mean concentration. But how do you measure concentrations at the base of the unsaturated zone to achieve this objective, particularly given that groundwater levels vary seasonally, so that has implications for your unsaturated soil source thickness and where you apply your assessment point. So ideally, you should apply your assessment point at your shallowest groundwater level. But also, how do you calculate an annual average when soil samples and leachate samples are spot measurements at a particular point of time? So it's not really practical to do this. What you can do is look at a lines of evidence approach for your soil source term. So for soil, you can look at leachate concentrations, although I'll put a word of warning that leachate concentrations for hazardous substances aren't always appropriate. You know, you could, they're really only appropriate for your sort of metals and some inorganic contaminants, not really appropriate for your hydrocarbons, chlorinated solvents, pHs, which are hydrophobic. They can result in volatilization. So you have to have a sense check whether leachate's actually suitable for your contaminant of concern. If you've got an apple, you can look at the effective solubility, but you could also look at other lines of evidence, such as your soil concentrations. You could undertake a level 1 calculation in RTM to calculate a theoretical leachate concentration that could be applied. But also your observations of contamination. What have you seen in the unsaturated zone? Does it give you cause for concern that you might have an ongoing soil source? One thing the guidance does allow you to do is consider concentrations in groundwater immediately below or adjacent to the source zone as a supporting line of evidence so you can help identify key contaminants that have entered into groundwater already. So essentially, you're using groundwater as a compliance point in this instance. But you do have to have that sense check. Will groundwater be reflective of future conditions, such as if you remove hard standing, you could get increased leaching, and so future groundwater concentrations may be different than what you can currently measure. So really, the consideration of assessment against compliance is going to be a key consideration for the assessment of hazardous substances. Compliance might be okay, because the objective is to control deterioration in groundwater quality. So if you're not seeing an impact in groundwater immediately below your source or adjacent to, then you could potentially justify that you may have met that objective, although it may need to be considered as an exemption. So once you've done that initial tier of assessment, if you think your source concentration is not going to exceed your input standard, no further assessments needed. But if it does exceed the input standard, then you're going to have to go to a next tier of assessment. So a tier 2 dilution assessment isn't appropriate because then you're applying dilution within groundwater, so it doesn't marry up with your assessment point for hazardous substances. And you'll need to move straight through to a tier 3 assessment if that's appropriate. Or you could consider whether there's an exemption from meeting the groundwater standards and objectives, if that would be applicable. So, tier 3 assessment for hazardous substances. It's going to be quite specific when you can include this. Your source will need to be fully within the unsaturated zone if you're going to look at attenuation within the unsaturated zone, as you can see from the wee diagram I've put in here. I don't know, being in Scotland, a lot of the time there's shallow groundwater, and I don't know whether, or know many instances whether you can fully justify that your source is completely unsaturated. Another thing you can think about is applying a declining soil source term, but that wouldn't be applicable if you've got NAPL sources, and also if you've got hard standing, it's probably not applicable for that scenario either, if that hard standing is to remain. So your input concentration, if there was applicable, would be multiplying your source concentration with an attenuation factor, and then if it comes below the input standard, no further assessments required. But if it goes above, then you'll need to consider whether an exemption is applicable. Another point to note is that RTM does not consider an unsaturated zone or allow soil washout, but CONSUM does. So if you thought this was applicable for your site, you are going to have to, undertake your assessment within a more detailed model. RTM isn't going to be able to cope with that. So I know I said that dilution isn't appropriate for hazardous substances, but I do think you could consider it when assessing compliance criteria for hazardous substances as part of an exemption. So I thought I'd put this slide in here. So one thing the guidance does say is if you're looking at a dilution assessment, so this would be the Tier 2 dilution assessment, which is equivalent to Tier 3 DQRA and LCRM, you need to look at source input loading calculations, but this isn't going to provide you a concentration to compare against the input standard because the loading rate is in units of milligrams per day and your input standard will be a concentration such as milligrams per litre. You could undertake dilution in the underlying groundwater body by undertaking a level 2 calculation in remedial targets model. So your input concentration would be your source concentration multiplied by a dilution factor. Now, I said before, it's really difficult to look at annual averages from soil concentrations, which it is, but your flow rate or your dilution factor, you can look at annual averages because the inputs that you're looking at can vary on seasonal basis, such as your infiltration rate, hydraulic gradient, and your depth of your mixing zone. So you could potentially look at annual averages from that point of view for hazardous substances. And ultimately, if following dilution, it's below the input standard, you won't need to do any further assessment. And if it's above, well, do you need to go to remediation or can you consider further the risks as part of an exemption? Okay, so that's hazardous substances. So now we're going on to non-hazardous substances, and hazardous substances have already entered into groundwater. So this will comprise starting at your Tier 2 GQRA or your Tier 1 screen and WAT PS10. So what I think you will need to do, or we will need to do, is initially undertake a direct comparison of groundwater concentrations with the threshold value or a site-specific value, but that would only be applicable if contaminants in background upgradient water quality are naturally elevated, so not applicable for anthropogenic contaminants. And this would apply to both your pollution and status objectives. So if your spot measured groundwater concentrations don't exceed the threshold value, then you don't need to consider the risk any further. There isn't a risk. However, if they do exceed the threshold value, I think the next step would be to look at your annual average concentration because that's your assessment statistic in the new guidance. So whenever you're doing your annual average calculations, they need to just look at the source and the plume. They shouldn't consider boreholes out with the source zone. And that's what I've tried to illustrate in this diagram here. The guidance says or suggests for simple sites, you need at least 3 data points per location to calculate an annual average. But for more complex sites, you are going to need a lot more data, which could be monthly monitoring over the course of a year. So you need to make sure you've got sufficient data to characterize your source and your plume, and that you've got enough monitoring rounds to calculate your annual average on the basis of the complexity of your site. So if your annual average is less than the threshold value, again, you're not going to have a risk. You can maybe stop your assessment at that point, but if it's more, then you're going to need to consider a spatial assessment. Whether the annual average exceeds the threshold value or not is going to depend on the number of monitoring points that you've got that exceed the threshold value in the first place, the magnitude of the concentration over the threshold value, and the number of rounds that threshold value's been exceeded over the course of your monitoring within that year, be it 3 rounds or 12 rounds. So if you have got a risk, you would then do a spatial assessment. And this is equivalent to, I would say, a more advanced GQRA. It's not just a screening exercise, as you need to consider your source and plume in more detail using site-specific data, but you're not doing any numerical modelling. So I think it falls somewhere between a GQRA and a DQRA, and this would be equivalent to the Tier 2 dilution assessment and what PS 1002 and applies to the spatial assessment. So if your plume and your source is contained on site and you've got sufficient coverage, then looking at the spatial assessment is going to be quite easy. You can generate plume plots and measure the area of that plume directly. So you can then see whether it exceeds that spatial assessment rule or not. So in addition to looking at your groundwater samples, you could also look at other factors to build up a picture of your plume geometry, particularly if you've got gaps in your monitoring well network. So you could think about, gas vapor monitoring data, contamination observations, or other methods such as geophysics, which might be able to delineate your plume. And as Isla was saying, if you've got multiple plumes, you need to make that consideration as to whether you assess them individually or cumulatively. However, the problem comes if your plume's migrating off-site or has the potential to migrate off-site. How do you apply your spatial assessment rule? It would be wonderful if we could put off-site boreholes in to really kind of fully characterize plume geometries, but that's not really realistic. One thing you could do is do a simple calculation to determine whether the plume would ever exceed the spatial assessment rule based on either locations of significantly hydraulically connected groundwater discharge zones, so for example, the sea or a major river, or whether it would exceed the maximum equivalent assessment points distances set by SEPA in their guidance, which is 500 metres for pollution or 4 kilometres for the status standard. So Isla's kind of already gone over this in her presentation, but just to recap, this slide is showing you how you would calculate a maximum estimated plume length. You need to have knowledge of your source width perpendicular to groundwater flow to allow this. So for the pollution standard, the assessment rule is a threshold value being exceeded over a 1 hectare area. So in this example, the width has been defined as 50 metres, and then this results in a maximum acceptable plume length or equivalent assessment point of 200 metres. So you essentially divide your plume area by the width to calculate an acceptable plume length. And you can do a similar approach for your status standards. So in this example, the status standard for your non-hazardous substances would exceed the maximum equivalent assessment point allowed by SEPA of 4 kilometres, so you would need to consider that further. You can also consider whether there are any hydraulic barriers that would prevent the plume from breaching the spatial assessment rule. So for example, the coast. So in this example, the status standard for hazardous substances would go beyond that, so you wouldn't need to consider it further. Similarly, if your equivalent assessment point is located on the opposite side of a river and you can demonstrate that base flow would entirely enter the river, then your river would be your receptor and groundwater would act as a pathway. But if you can't, if you can't demonstrate that the river would receive the plume as base flow, you need to take a precautionary approach and consider risks to both the future groundwater resource and the river. So following the GQRA, you would have one of these outcomes. Either no assessment is needed because your plume exceeding the threshold value is less than the spatial assessment rule. If it's greater than the assessment rule, then you move on to the next tier of risk assessment or consider an exemption. I would say the Tier 3 DQRA, it's only going to really be appropriate where you've got a plume migrating off-site and it falls below that spatial assessment rule. So For the Tier 3 assessment, you'll need to model off-site plume development. It's important you've got suitable and sufficient data to undertake the monitoring. Fully 3D models, such as groundwater vistas, are data intensive, and they might be more suitable for more complex sites. They're not going to be commercially viable for your more basic land contamination sources. So RTM and CONSUM are the ones the industry is most familiar with. They're linear assessment models that assess risk from the downgradient edge of the source, but the new guidance requires assessment to be undertaken from the upgradient source boundary. So you're going to have to calculate equivalent assessment points to apply within the model. And that's what I've done in this slide here. So essentially, it's a similar example to what I've done before, where we calculate a 200-meter equivalent assessment point for your pollution standard. But to apply the intermediate targets methodology, you need to take away the length of your source from that. So you can essentially assess risks from the upgradient boundary rather than the downgradient boundary. So if you were applying this with the remedial targets methodology, your assessment distance would be 100 metres and not 200 metres. Hopefully that makes sense. And I've put the sort of calculations I've put in here. Some things to think about is your source. So that is what is causing input into groundwater. And then once it enters into groundwater, it becomes a plume. So have you got enough data to characterize your source dimensions? The current plume is what I've illustrated in orange on the slide. So that's kind of what can be measured on site. That might be useful for undertaking model calibrations if your measured plume is on site. And then the yellow is your predicted plume. Will it exceed your assessment point or not? So if your plume area exceeding the threshold value is less than your spatial assessment rule, then you've not got a risk following your Tier 3 assessment. But if it does exceed the spatial assessment rule, then you might want to consider applying for an exemption to the groundwater objective. So now looked at the risk assessment, I'm going to touch on briefly the exemptions. So if you have assessed a risk to future groundwater resource potential, the agreed remedial action may not be to achieve the assessment criteria defined under the groundwater objectives if an exemption can be applied. SEPA will consider an exemption from meeting the groundwater objectives from historical land contamination on the following grounds: that the remediation measures are not technically feasible, they will increase a risk to human health or the quality of the environment as a whole, or that the remediation measures are disproportionately costly with respect to the environmental benefit, providing that remediation of the sources of hazardous substances have been completed as far as possible. So that'd be like your NAPL, your soil leachate, any tanks, infrastructure that's there that could provide an ongoing source. It also doesn't think, or SEPA also doesn't think that it would be disproportionately costly to look at source management to break pollutant linkages for non-hazardous substances and hazardous substances that have already entered into groundwater, unless it's supported by a detailed cost-benefit analysis. As I was saying, the objective for historical land contamination is betterment, and at least partial remediation of the source is likely to be required if you're found to not be compliant with your groundwater objectives. So this slide is just looking at exemptions from meeting the groundwater objectives on the basis of disproportionate cost. This will be site specific, and a key question to consider is what is the degree of actual or potential impact on the water environment, and what level of risk can be considered acceptable by the regulator. So this will require consideration of several factors, such as the scale of the contamination impacts, the expected timescale for contamination inputs to persist without remediation, and the sensitivity of the affected receptor. You could undertake some more modelling, even though you've assessed your risk, to look at the significance. So, for example, you could model to see what the maximum spatial extent of the plume potential impact would be, what distance and over what time period would concentrations fall below the threshold value. Another thing to think about is your plume shrinking, stable, or expanding, because that could have implications. And also, how likely is your groundwater to be used as a resource by humans or ecological receptors? And I think that will be an important consideration when placing a value on the aquifer for cost-benefit analysis. And that probably is something that requires a little bit more guidance on, and how you undertake a cost-benefit analysis. So finally, just to recap, I'm not going to go over this because I'm conscious of time. Everyone can sort of read what's there. But it is a new approach that we've got in Scotland. We are going to have to consider how we're going to apply it within our reports and our risk assessments, and how we use the exemptions. One of the critical things is going to be making sure we've got adequate characterisation of our site. And Alison is going to be touching on this in her presentation. So I will stop now and I will hand over to Alison. Just leaves me to say thank you very much for listening. I hope you've found it useful.
Thank you very much for that, Helen. I'm conscious of time, but for everyone that can stay with us, please do, because I think Alison's presentation is well worth hearing. So I'll pass straight over to her. So Alison Mackay is partner at Leapmore, and her presentation today is on the implications for site characterisation and data in relation to the new groundwater standards and guidance. So I will pass over to you now, Alison.
Thanks. Can you just check that you can see my slide okay? Since it crashed my computer last time I tried.
Yeah, we can. Yeah.
Cool. Hi everyone. I don't know about you, but I feel as though I could just go in and just put myself in a darkened room after that. It is a lot to take in. I don't really want to add much to that, but I thought it'd be worth just having a wee look at some of the implications for site characterisation and for data. Again, this is by no means like comprehensive run through of everything that you should be thinking about, but hopefully what it will do is give you a wee taste about what's in the guidance so that you can go and read it for yourself. As Isla said, the new version of the Brown Booklet, which hasn't been a Brown Booklet for a while, but it does have the same sort of like principles and stuff like that, but there are some changes. So I wanted to touch a wee bit on that in terms of the types of data that SEPA are looking for and any reports that are going into them. I also wanted to touch on some of the specific considerations that are related to data that are in the new WOT PS10. So the Brown Booklet, I mean, it came out in 2001 originally. I was trying to remember whether I actually wrote any of it. I probably did because I was at SEPA at the time. And it was rehashed in 2012. This version, like, it has a similar approach, but I think one key distinction from it is that the previous guidance was very much all about assessing risks in relation to Part 2A, whereas this new guidance includes planning as well. So that I think is a key difference in it. In terms of what it covers, I think Isla's covered some of this already, but it has, similar to what the old guidance had in terms of legislation and roles and interactions, obviously it includes some of the planning stuff there as well. It sets out how to assess the impacts on the water environment in relation to planning and Part 2A, and summarises the sort of remediation requirements as well. But what I'm going to concentrate on just now is just some of the site characterisation parts of it. So obviously a key part in doing risk assessment is characterising the site. So when you need to carry out this risk assessment, taking a staged approach, identifying whether you actually have any water environment receptors, characterising the site, and then identifying your pollutant linkages and considering the risk. The guidance doesn't go as far as mentioning LCRM, But I think that's probably just a matter of timing, because it will come. In terms of the site characterisation, then one of the key things that's in the new Brown Book, I was going to call it a Brown Booklet because it's easier to say than the actual name of the guidance. The new Brown Booklet is about what minimum data requirements SEPA would be looking for, and that's set out in Appendix 4. So it's definitely worth having a wee look at that. And it's not an exhaustive list, but it's a sort of minimum. And basically SEPA are saying that if you don't have this minimum data in it, then they will not be reviewing the report. So this could be reports that are maybe submitted to SEPA by local authorities as part of their Part 2A duties, or it could be ones where they have reports that have been submitted to local authority as part of planning, which maybe have complex groundwater issues, which they would ask SEPA for to consult on. So in terms of the actual data then that they would be looking for, I think one of the key things is they want all the details, they want all the information that you have about how you came about doing your site characterisation and how you've collected your data and how you've handled your data. So it's the usual sort of general site information that you would expect. Locations of any sort of sources like tanks and things like that. Details of the types of contamination they've said should be sort of like marked up against each area. So I think they're obviously thinking about some sort of like visual thing there. And also your locations, obviously, of your exploratory holes from current and historic information investigations. In terms of the hydrogeological parts, there's a lot of detail on that, so I would certainly say go and look at it. There's a big reference to things which I have certainly found being deficient in reports when I've been reviewing them, things like having investigation positions surveyed into meters of the OD, for example. But yeah, they are looking for details in terms of borehole logs and the construction of any borehole monitoring wells as well. In terms of soil and groundwater data, there's obviously reference to expecting that you'll carry out the work in accordance with BS 10175 and 5930. They're expecting you to have full sampling details presented, and also having sufficiently low limits of detection to enable comparison of data with appropriate assessment criteria. And I'll come on to that a wee bit in a minute. They're also looking for original data. So like you should have your original lab certificates, for example, in there. But basically, in my view, SEPA is basically saying, give us the report that represents good practice, with an inference that the reports that are currently being received don't contain this data. And I certainly know from speaking to local authorities that they still have significant issues with poor quality reporting that are submitted to them as part of planning applications. So just a reminder that this list is in Appendix 4 of the new Brown Booklet. And so if you can go and have a wee look there, it would definitely be worth having a look at for when you're preparing your reports. The other thing that might be useful to you would be the local authority guidance document, which was produced by Environmental Protection Scotland. You can get that on their website, and that's got other information about technical reporting guidance. And I'm assuming that, given the sad news of them dissolving earlier this week, that in the future that will be held by IES. So yeah, we're going to download it just now in case it disappears. So just quickly moving on then to some specific considerations for the application of the groundwater standards in accordance with the new WAP PS 10. And again, this is a snapshot, so please go and read the full thing. I won't really dwell on this because I think Isla's already mentioned about the groundwater standards and where they come from. Yes, you can go and derive your own standard if there's one that's not published, but it has to be within in accordance with the Scottish Government directions. And that, you can also propose an alternative HCV as well if you use the WHO methodology. But that's like a whole 2-day webinar in itself. So I'll leave that there and just mention it here just to raise awareness of that. In terms of the application of the standards, then there's sort of like 3 parts to it. So there's the actual concentration, then there's the location, and then the statistic. And I think Helen sort of like took you through that for the various things, various scenarios. This slide, it's not meant to read across at all. It's just giving you examples of the concentrations. So there could be threshold values, use-based standards, environmental standards for surface water. In terms of location, I think Helen talked about unsaturated zone and your 1 hectare and points of abstraction. And then the types of statistics could be, it's either an annual average you're comparing or a maximum or some other relevant statistic for surface water. And I think, again, I think Helen sort of touched on this as well in terms of modifying standards. It used to be something that we would do in the past where you would say, okay, well, the standard is X, but we've got background, so we're going to subtract that from that or add it to it to give us a bigger standard to work to. Well, that's not possible anymore. So you have to use the standard without modifying it if it's anthropogenic influences. And yeah, it does mean that if you've got high concentrations of a contaminant coming onto your site, which you're also contributing to, then if that's exceeding the standard, then you have got a bit of an issue. You're probably having to look at exemptions at that point. If it's not exceeding the standard when it's coming onto your site, then you basically have whatever's left in the standard, is the way I would put it, for your site to contribute. So yeah, I think someone had mentioned in the comments about fairness, and yet it's maybe not fair. So I think we need to, as Helen says, see how this actually works out in practice when we actually do these, where we've got sites which maybe, like the Chrome sites, for example, where you've got multiple sources of the same type of contaminant, and see how that comes out in the wash, as it were. Another thing as well is about managing limits of quantification, just to look out for that as well. So the starting point is to try and achieve your limit of detection or limit of quantification that is below the relevant standard. They don't say how far below the minimum standard, below the standard. So, I mean, in the past, I've always sort of had a rule of thumb of 10% below the standard to give you a bit of leeway. But certainly it says to be, you should have a limit of detection for your contaminant that's below the relevant standard. If you can't achieve this, then there is additional guidance there, including the use of minimum achievable limits of detection as an initial screening value, and then adopting a lines of evidence approach to determine the potential significance of any consequential uncertainties then. There is also a clear steer towards taking a precautionary approach, though, in relation to particularly sensitive receptors such as potable water supplies and designated ecosystems and habitats. So just watch out for that. These are just a couple of particular analytical considerations. You'll find these in the notes part of the list of groundwater standards document. There's some information there about PEHs and when it's, when BAP is used as an indicator of risk and what PFAS it uses in terms of the summing of the PFAS to create the to come up with the standard. So this obviously has implications in terms of your analysis to make sure that when you're scheduling your analysis that the PFAS that the lab are looking for is equivalent to the Scottish 20 PFAS. Also pesticides as well, there's similar considerations for doing your analysis for pesticide suites as well. Chrome 6 is one that might be particularly relevant. So although there's been a recent hazardous determination made for Chrome 6, The standard's still based on total chromium dissolved. And this is because there's no accepted standard for chrome 6, unlike the total chromium, which is a value which is, and that's due to sort of practical issues with speciated analysis. So when you're comparing your laboratory data with assessment criteria, SEPA is now recommending that dissolved or filtered chromium data is assumed to be chrome 6 unless it's proven otherwise. And if you have no dissolved or filtered data available, then SEPA recommends professional judgment is applied as to the likely speciation based on the hydrogeological setting. So just something to be aware of when you're looking at chrome data. I just want to go on now just to do a short bit on calculating annual averages. There's a whole load of guidance in there about how to calculate annual averages to be able to compare against the standards. It sets out how and when you can account for seasonal variations in loading, and that you should only calculate annual average on a temporal basis, and you can use rolling years instead of a calendar year if it's appropriate. One of the things that's probably of most interest is the minimum data points. And again, I think Helen touched on this, but it's got these sort of general sort of suggestions for the data requirements and the guidance. So, for example, having a snapshot, we're talking about 3 rounds at least a week apart. Or if there's significant seasonality, then that would be quarterly for 12 months or monthly for at least 6 months during the relevant seasons, obviously, when the seasonality actually comes into play. If you've got a complex or a higher risk site, then we're talking about monthly for at least 12 months. And then if you've got longer term, then phased approach with potential for reducing over time based on observations and things like that. So that guidance is in there for minimum data points. Obviously, it's going to be site specific to what the conditions are at your site. There's also some good guidance in there about statistical considerations for the calculations and what to do with things like non-detects. So non-detects, they say, take it as 50% of the limit of detection. There's also a helpful prompt to look at your distribution in your data set to make sure that to make a judgment of whether the geometric or arithmetic mean would be the most appropriate to use to compare against the standard. There's also a prompt for using confidence intervals to aid decision making, and also when undertaking probabilistic predictive modelling, you should use the 95 percentile value compared to the relevant standard, because they deem that the 50th percentile value is not necessarily equivalent to the annual average. So you can use alternative. You can also use alternative statistical approaches if you appropriately justify them. And this is a bit of a theme. I think there's lots of flexibility built into it, and SEPA are, I think, open to other approaches if you can actually adequately justify them. Another thing that's quite useful in the guidance is how to deal with outliers. There's a fair bit of guidance on that, and outliers are extreme values that differ from most of the other data points in your data set. So they can have a big impact on your statistical analysis and skew the results of any hypothesis test. So it's really important to get this right. But it is important to recognise that some outliers represent true values from natural variation in the population, and so they should be kept in your data set. But there might be instances where they might be, for example, a result of documented unrepresented sampling or a problem with the analysis, and those might be warrant exclusion. So you need to know the cause of the outlier and have a very good reason to exclude the data point. And in particular, they sort of set out some particular situations where you'd be really careful if you're considering exclusion, excluding the data from your assessment. Just to finish up then, some other data for you to consider maybe early on. This is, again, it's by no means a comprehensive list, but just some things that you might want to think about if you're doing site characterisation, so that you have sufficient data to undertake the different tiers of the water environment risk assessment. There's definitely a strong suggestion for the use of site-specific values in favour of literature values in the guidance. It's also important to adequately define your source area, as you will need that to determine your contaminant load rates for a Tier 2 assessment. So this means having sufficient data points as part of your investigation or a robust case study information on the source area. Also, you need to have sufficient information on your upgrading water quality. It might mean you need to do that then as part of a staged investigation if you can't reliably predict your groundwater flow direction. Also sufficient information to assess your future groundwater resource, including flow direction and your source width perpendicular to flow and things like that. And then there's also potential data that you want to collect to decide whether your water body in superficial deposits or your groundwater in superficial deposit is a groundwater body. So at the moment, all groundwater within superficial deposits that have been mapped with SEPA as groundwater bodies is considered to have resource potential. And if the superficial deposits aren't mapped, then the guidance sets out the type of information that SEPA would consider acceptable to determine whether the groundwater within them had future resource potential. So you can have a look at the details of that. So if your superficial deposits in your site aren't currently mapped, then you can either assume that it's resource potential or you can assess it accordingly and gather this type of evidence and present that to see why it is not a groundwater body and not a receptor. And the guidance gives sort of like 3 stages of increasing complexity on this, increasing complexity and increasing cost. And it is based on a lines of evidence approach. So I would urge you to go and have a wee look at that. Now, I appreciate that that we're probably well over time. And I know that I've covered a lot here. And between mine and Isla and Helen, you are probably got your heads exploding. But I think the key message for me is basically there's lots more than we've covered today. Go and read all the documents and then read them again and then probably read them again to get your head around them. Also, Isla is doing a talk next week, I think it is, at IES. We'll make sure that link goes out either in the chat. I think Eve was going to post it in the chat, or I can put it in any sort of like I'll put it on our LinkedIn group as well. And I'm just going to stop sharing just now, and I've got a quick poll while we start the questions, and if you could maybe just this poll if I can find it. While I find the poll, do you want to just start the Q&A? The poll's really just about whether you would want to have some training on this. So I'll try and figure out how to get that posted up while you start the questions.
Yeah, so on the questions, Isla and Helen have helpfully, since we've been very tight for time, gone through and answered quite a lot of them themselves. So the plan is that we're going to send out a bit of a FAQ sheet after the fact on this. So if there's any questions that we don't quite get to today, or we'll recap the answers from the ones that we've got on that as well, and we'll distribute to that to everyone. But also, if anybody goes away tonight and thinks of a burning question that they didn't ask at the time, if you want to email the admin at SCLF email address, if there's anything that you think of just in the next little while, we can try and incorporate those questions into that when sent out. So I'm just having a scroll through, and Isla and Helen have done quite a good job of answering most of these questions. Just check if there's any that we don't have an answer to. I think you guys have been actually amazing, and we've got answers to pretty much all of these. There's one here from Matthew. How do you define if hazardous substances have already entered groundwater? Does this take into account background concentrations off-site, and must there be a plume of contamination on-site and not isolated spikes in only certain boreholes on site for hazardous substances to be considered to have already entered groundwater. Isla, is that one for you or for Helen maybe? Can anyone help with Matthew's?
I'm happy to do an initial bit in Isla. If I'm wrong, then you can please correct me.
Sure.
As I said, it is, the guidance is out there and how we are interpreting it. So I would say how you define if hazardous substances have already entered into your groundwater. Well, that would be undertaking groundwater sampling and comparing them against the threshold value. So do they exceed that? If they do, well, potentially you've got hazardous substances have already entered into groundwater. And must there be a plume and not isolated spikes for your hazardous substances? The objective of hazardous substances is to control their input. So I think if you are getting, if you are finding them detected above their threshold value, then yes, you've got an input. But remember, your assessment criteria is based on an annual average. So if you're looking at your groundwater concentrations as sort of a compliance, then you might be able to, average them out to determine whether or not that is actually a risk or significant risk to go forward. And the background concentrations, take into account background. I guess that's characterizing your plume and your site. So you would have to say whether it's actually background anthropogenic contamination coming onto your site. So making sure you've got up gradient boreholes, that would be one way of looking at it. But you can't take into account anthropogenic background when you're assessing your risk. Then you'd have to go back to your soil source because it's controlling of hazardous substances into groundwater. So look at your soil source. Does that indicate the contaminants that you're identifying in your groundwater samples have come from your site or off-site? It is going to be a bit of a lines of evidence approach. So I don't know if that answers, or if Isla, you want to add anything in, or Alison to that.
I think I would reiterate your comment that you don't need to have a plume, a defined, clear plume, to have entry. So do you have entry of groundwater? If you're finding it in groundwater, then by definition, then it has entered, or is it continuing to enter? But it has at least entered. Whether or not you have ongoing entry, if you have background contamination, might be difficult to assess by just looking at groundwater alone, and therefore you at that point, looking at other lines of evidence might be the more appropriate approach. So where you already have the hazardous substance present from upgradient, then just looking at your groundwater data alone might not be enough to determine entry. You might have to look at your source zone data as well.
And I think as well, Isla, there's a bit of chat about like off-site upgradient contamination coming onto a site. I think if I can just summarise what I think you've said in the response is that there's not an intention that people should remediate contamination that's coming from off-site, but if the addition of your contamination to already existing contamination puts it above a certain value, then you do need to take that into account, but you don't have to over-remediate. You're not expected to remediate anything that's coming from off-site, but you do need to factor it into your calculations, if I understand what you've written in response to the question.
Yes. So this is one thing where land contamination in particular, if you're looking at a brownfield site that's surrounded by other brownfield sites and you have groundwater quality that's already affected by the time it reaches your site, there's no expectation that you would be required to remediate that. However, in your risk assessment, you would be looking at, are you having a cumulative pressure on the groundwater? Is there more entering the groundwater within your site? And can that be remediated such that you are making the overall situation better by reducing inputs within your control, so the inputs that are within your site. But there's no expectation that you would necessarily achieve full cleanup. This criteria, it really applies much more to new activities, where you've got new entry. So, you know, you're building a landfill, you're putting in a septic tank. These are the situations where that criteria is going to be more stringently applied. But for historical land contamination, yes, it needs to be taken into account in your risk assessment, but when it comes to your remedial strategy, you know, the surrounding context can be taken into account as part of the justification about what is, you know, proportional to do on a given site. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, I think so. And as I'm going through it, I think thank you very much to you both, because I think that you've answered most of the other questions on that were raised on there. So again, we'll try and put that together into a bit of an FAQs, and I appreciate there was an awful lot to get through today. We have gone over time, but I think it was needed. There was just so much subject matter. So thank you so much to Isla, to Helen, and to Alison for the presentations today. We were never going to learn it all in the webinar today, so I think the takeaway from everybody has been for everyone to go out and read through all the guidance and documentation themselves and see what everybody makes of it. But yeah, thanks very much for sticking with us, and to our presenters today, thank you very much for your time.
If I could just add that if people do have questions or feedback on the guidance, they're more than welcome to send those through to SEPA. You know, guidance is never fixed for infinity and beyond. So, you know, if people have feedback, we can take it into account in future iterations. Or if people have questions, that I've already had questions since this came out, but you know, if people do have questions, they are more than welcome to send them through to us, and we will do our best to respond.
And Isla, I believe your presentation at IES is going to be a little bit maybe more in depth than the one you did today, so we'll circulate the link for that as well if people want to join on that one as well.
Yes, although I would say that a lot of the extra, I have a longer slot with IES, so there will be more of me talking, but a lot of the extra things I will be covering are things that both Alison and Helen covered in their presentations. So it's not necessarily there'll be huge amounts new beyond today, but there will be more of me because it's only me.
Perfect. Okay, well, I think unless you've got anything else, Alison, I think that's maybe us. Yeah, just thanks again to everyone for joining today and for sticking with us. I hope everyone got something out of it. And thanks once again to Isla, to Helen, and to Alison for all their time putting together their presentations today. So yeah, we'll see you next time. Thanks very much.